All right, let's go ahead and read Beowulf. Keep in mind that we are coming into this story essentially in the middle of it. We're only reading an excerpt, which is a small piece of this full length epic poem. So, if there's something that maybe has not been explicitly stated in the text, I'll make sure to clarify that for you as we read. The monster Grendel. A powerful monster living down in the darkness growled in pain, impatient, as day after day the music rang loud in that hall, the harps rejoicing. The fact that it uses the words that hall implies that we should already know what hall they're talking about. It basically means a giant meeting room, a dining hall where all of these warriors are gathered. Okay? So Hrothgar's men lived happy in his hall, till the monster stirred, that demon, that fiend, Grendel, who haunted the moors, the wild marshes, and made his home in a hell, not hell, but earth. He was spawned in that slime, conceived by a pair of those monsters born of Cain, murderous creatures banished by God, punished forever for the crime of Abel's death. The Almighty drove those demons out, and their exile was bitter. Shut away from men, they split into 1,000 forms of evil, spirits and fiends, goblins, monsters, giants, a brood forever opposing the Lord's will, and again defeated. So what it's saying about Grendel specifically is that he's essentially a monster that came about as punishment for the death of Abel. If you are not familiar, the story of Cain and Abel comes from the Bible, in which one brother murdered the other out of jealousy. And essentially, this section of the text is saying that we've got a group of warriors who are living their best life in this awesome hall, and a monster is coming out of the moors, the marshes, so this wild land, to come and get these warriors. Then, when darkness had dropped, Grendel went up to Hroth. Hroth is the name of the hall, wondering what the warriors would do in that hall when their drinking was done. He found them sprawled in sleep, suspecting nothing, their dreams undisturbed. The monster's thoughts were as quick as his greed or his claws. He slipped through the door, and there in the silence snatched up 30 men, smashed them, unknowing in their beds, and ran out with their bodies, the blood dripping behind him, back to his lair, delighted with his night's slaughter. At daybreak, with the sun's first light, they saw how well he had worked, and in that gray morning broke their long feast with tears and laments for the dead. Hrothgar, their lord, sat joyless. Grendel came again, so set on murder that no crime could ever be enough. No savage assault quench his lust for evil. Then each warrior tried to escape him. So that's where we're going to pause for page 1. Essentially, this section 2 right now is saying that the warriors were in the hall, they were feasting, they were drinking, eventually they fell asleep, and while they slept, the monster Grendel came into the hall and snatched up, he took 30 of Hrothgar's men. He basically smashed them and grabbed them, and he ran back to his lair. And when they woke up in the morning, there were tears and laments for the dead. Laments meaning like sorrow, kind of like that that really deep, inconsolable praying to God. Oh no, how could this ever happen? And line 50 is telling us that Grendel is going to come back again and again. He is so set on committing this evil act. All right. To escape him, searched for rest in different beds, as far from Heret as they could find, seeing how Grendel hunted when they slept. Distance was safety. The only survivors were those who fled him. Hate had triumphed. So Grendel ruled, fought with the righteous, one against many, and won. So Heret stood empty and stayed deserted for years. 12 winters of grief for Hrothgar, king of the Danes, sorrow heaped at his door by hell-forged hands. His misery leaped the seas, was told and sung in all men's ears, how Grendel's hatred began, how the monster relished his savage war on the Danes, keeping the bloody feud alive, seeking no peace, offering no truce, accepting no settlement, no price in gold or land, and paying the living for one crime only with another. I'm going to pause there for just a moment. So basically, now that they've been terrorized, all of the men fled the hall and went somewhere safer. Distance was safety. They knew the further they got, the safer they were. Heret, being the hall, stood empty, meaning nobody was there for 12 years. We have 12 winters of grief for Hrothgar. So that's his pride and joy. He loved this amazing hall where his warriors would gather and feast and celebrate their victories. So while it was standing empty and no men could enjoy it, he was feeling terrible. His misery leaped the seas. That's a bit of hyperbole, basically saying that his misery was so great, it was greater than the ocean. It also carried across the ocean on boats. Travelers would tell tales of Hrothgar's sadness at being tormented by this monster who would take nothing. There was nothing they could give him to make him stop killing Hrothgar's men. All right, so back to line 72. No one waited for reparation from his plundering claws. That shadow of death hunted in the darkness, stalked Hrothgar's warriors, old and young, lying in wait, hidden in mist, invisibly following them from the edge of the marsh, always there, unseen. So mankind's enemy continued his crimes, killing as often as he could, coming alone, bloodthirsty and horrible. Though he lived in Heret, when the night hid him, he never dared to touch King Hrothgar's glorious throne, protected by God. God, whose love Grendel could not know. But Hrothgar's heart was bent. The best and most noble of his council debated remedies, sat in secret sessions, talking of the terror, and wondering what the bravest of warriors could do. And sometimes they sacrificed to the old stone gods, made heathen vows, hoping for hell's support, the devil's guidance in driving their affliction off. That was their way, and the heathen's only hope, hell always in their hearts. So, we have Grendel, who is still stalking his men. If anybody should show up to that hall, they're dead. The end. He's going to snatch them up. Interestingly enough, though, it tells us that no matter how much time he spent in Hrothgar's hall, he never touched his throne because it was protected by God. And if we remember from that very first page, Grendel is a product of evil, and therefore that throne is protected by God from him. He couldn't touch it even if he wanted to. While this is going on, it says the best and most noble of his council debated remedies. So they sat there and they tried to figure out how do we fix this? They tried everything they could, including turning away from their Christian values and back to the pagan style of sacrificing to other gods, making vows to other supernatural beings, saying, we don't care who helps us as long as somebody helps us. So the living sorrow of Healfdene's son simmered, bitter and fresh, and no wisdom or strength could break it. That agony hung on king and people alike, harsh and unending, violent and cruel and evil. So Healfdene's son is Hrothgar, and they're basically saying that as they continued to live, they continued to be terrorized. In his far-off home, Beowulf, Hygelac's follower and the strongest of the Geats, greater and stronger than anyone anywhere in this world, heard how Grendel filled nights with horror, and quickly commanded a boat fitted out, proclaiming that he'd go to that famous king. So Hrothgar and his men are the Danes, and we're now introducing a new group of people called the Geats. Beowulf is basically this leader of the Geats. Now, he's not the king of the Geats. That would be Hygelac, and that's why he's called Hygelac's follower. But he is like their best warrior. He heard about what was going on, and he was like, I need to go take care of that. Chose the mightiest men he could find, the bravest and best of the Geats, 14 in all, and led them down to their boat. He knew the sea, would point the prow straight to that distant Danish shore. He took 14 guys with him, the best that he could find. They hopped in a boat and they headed straight for Denmark. The feast ends. Beowulf and his men take the place of Hrothgar's followers and lie down to sleep in Heorot. Beowulf, however, is wakeful, eager to meet his enemy. The part that we're missing here, what these dashes mean, is that Beowulf arrived, told King Hrothgar why he was there, and they had a celebration feast in his honor, keeping in mind that anybody who slept in the hall became food for Grendel. Beowulf and his men chose to stay there. They were waiting for Grendel to attack. Pretty much everybody lay down to sleep except Beowulf. He's wakeful, so he's excited, eager. He's ready for Grendel to show up. Now we get to the battle with Grendel. Out from the marsh, from the foot of misty hills and bogs, bearing God's hatred, Grendel came, hoping to kill anyone he could trap on this trip to High Heorot. He moved quickly through the cloudy night, up from his swampland, sliding silently toward that gold-shining hall. He had visited Hrothgar's home before, knew the way. But never, before nor after that night, found Heorot defended so firmly, his reception so harsh. He journeyed, forever joyless, straight to the door, then snapped it open, tore its iron fasteners with a touch, and rushed angrily over the threshold. He strode quickly across the inlaid floor, snarling and fierce. His eyes gleamed in the darkness, burned with a gruesome light. Then he stopped, seeing the hall. So, it's nighttime. He's headed to the hall, trying to find out who he can kill. But neither before that night nor after that night, never ever had he found it defended so well. So that means that everything was closed up, locked up tight. And at this point, he's feeling a little angry. He is ready to kill. And he's starting to feel like maybe somebody's trying to stand in his way and make it just a little bit harder for him. The hall crowded with sleeping warriors, stuffed with rows of young soldiers resting together. And his heart laughed. He relished the sight, intended to tear the life from those bodies by morning. The monster's mind was hot with the thought of food and the feasting his belly would soon know. But fate that night intended Grendel to gnaw the broken bones of his last human supper. Human eyes were watching his evil steps, waiting to see his swift, hard claws. Grendel snatched at the first geat he came to, ripped him apart, cut his body to bits with powerful jaws, drank the blood from his veins, and bolted him down, hands and feet. Death and Grendel's great teeth came together, snapping life shut. Then he stepped to another still body, clutched at Beowulf with his claws, grasped at a strong-hearted, wakeful sleeper, and was instantly seized himself, claws bent back as Beowulf leaned up on one arm. Let's pause there. He goes in, he sees all these people sleeping, and he's like, all right, dinner time. But fate that night intended Grendel to gnaw the broken bones of his last human supper. I mean, there's a little bit of foreshadowing for you that it's telling you that after tonight, Grendel will not be eating any more humans. Fate, as an entity, made a plan, and that plan was that Grendel was done. He picked up one of Beowulf's guys, tore him apart, just completely destroyed his body. And then he got to Beowulf, thinking, here's one more. Beowulf had other plans. That shepherd of evil, guardian of crime, knew at once that nowhere on earth had he met a man whose hands were harder. So he knew he was in trouble right there. His mind was flooded with fear, but nothing could take his talons and himself from that tight, hard grip. Grendel's one thought was to run from Beowulf, flee back to his marsh and hide there. This was a different Heret than the hall he had emptied. So he wants to run away. He's not stupid. He can see that he's on the losing end of this battle. But Higelac's follower, remember that's Beowulf, remembered his final boast and, standing erect, stopped the monster's flight, fastened those claws in his fists till they cracked, clutched Grendel closer. The infamous killer fought for his freedom, wanting no flesh but retreat, desiring nothing but escape. His claws had been caught. He was trapped. That trip to Heret was a miserable journey for the writhing monster. So he legitimately wants to leave, but Beowulf made a promise. He's going to finish this once and for all for Hrothgar and his men. So he grabs Grendel's claws, one in each hand, and basically squishes his fists until they're completely broken. And Grendel knows now that this really is the end. He still had this ray of hope that he could get out, that he might be able to escape with just barely his life. But he knows that not to be true anymore. Hrothgar's wise men had fashioned Heret to stand forever. Only fire, they had planned, could shatter what such skill had put together, swallow in hot flames such splendor of ivory and iron and wood. Basically, this hall is so strong, so structurally sound, that fire is the only thing that could destroy it. Suddenly, the sounds changed. The Danes started in new terror, cowering in their beds as the terrible screams of the Almighty's enemy sang in the darkness, the horrible shrieks of pain in defeat, the tears torn out of Grendel's taut throat, Hell's captive caught in the arms of him who of all the men on earth was the strongest. So at first, they were afraid of Grendel as the monster. Now they're horrified by the sounds that they're hearing, that basically this monster is being torn apart and making sounds that they have never heard before. Terrible, horrible shrieks of pain. That mighty protector of men, again Beowulf, meant to hold the monster till its life leaped out, knowing the fiend was no use to anyone in Denmark. All of Beowulf's band had jumped from their beds, ancestral swords raised and ready, determined to protect their prince if they could. Their courage was great, but all wasted. They could hack at Grendel from every side, trying to open a path for his evil soul, but their points could not hurt him. The hardest and sharpest iron could not scratch at his skin, for that sin-stained demon had bewitched all men's weapons, laid spells that blunted every mortal man's blade. So, Beowulf was determined to kill him. He knew that Grendel served no purpose to anybody except terrorizing humans and eating them. Beowulf's guys jumped in, were trying to help him out, but as it turned out, Grendel had cast a spell over mortal men's weapons. So regular guys, no matter how strong and awesome they are, Their weapons would not work. Iron and steel were of no use. They couldn't cut him, they couldn't scratch him, they couldn't stab him. And yet his time had come. His days were over, his death near. Down to hell he would go, swept groaning and helpless to the waiting hands of still worse fiends. Now he discovered, once the afflicter of men, tormentor of their days, what it meant to feud with Almighty God. Grendel saw that his strength was deserting him, his claws bound fast. Hygelac's brave follower tearing at his hands. The monster's hatred rose higher, but his power had gone. He twisted in pain, and the bleeding sinews deep in his shoulder snapped. Muscle and bone split and broke. The battle was over. Beowulf had been granted new glory. Grendel escaped, but wounded as he was, could flee to his den, his miserable hole at the bottom of the marsh, only to die, to wait for the end of all his days. So they couldn't use man-made weapons to kill him. But Beowulf is considered the hero of God in this story, and Grendel is considered the enemy of God in this story, born of demons, born of this ultimate crime of brother killing brother, and therefore Beowulf was able to defeat him, even though weapons couldn't. He twisted so that his shoulder snapped, muscle and bone split and broke. Now at this point, Grendel is still technically alive, and he ran away to his hole in the ground, but he knew that he would die from this. And after that bloody combat, the Danes laughed with delight. He who had come to them from across the sea, bold and strong-minded, had driven affliction off, purged Hrothgar clean. He was happy now with that night's fierce work. The Danes had been served as he'd boasted he'd serve them. Beowulf, a prince of the Geats, had killed Grendel, ended the grief, the sorrow, the suffering forced on Hrothgar's helpless people by a bloodthirsty fiend. No Dane doubted the victory, for the proof, hanging high from the rafters where Beowulf had hung it, was the monster's arm, claw and shoulder and all. So once they saw Grendel run away, everybody was like laughing and cheering and just so excited because this terrible, terrible monster was gone. Beowulf lived up to the promise he had made to save the Danes from Grendel, and their trophy, hanging from the ceiling of the hall, was the arm of Grendel that Beowulf had snatched off at the shoulder.